Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. It is such a great pleasure to be with you again. For those people who have been with me along this webinar series, we're up to number 5. And for those that haven't before, I hope that you find this particular webinar interesting enough that maybe you want to go back and ask for the other replays. Let me share my screen and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. So just bear with me for one moment, please. So as Mylene said, this is all about emotional intelligence for children and building their social emotional well-being. And as I said, also, this is our 5th webinar in this series. Today, I want to go on a bit of a journey, and I want everyone to kind of come along for this journey. And it may not be particularly easy. So hang on there. We have good news, but just hang on for a little bit. I'm going to look at what do we mean by emotional intelligence and social emotional well-being. There's a lot of words that come up when we talk about these topics. So I want to kind of pull that apart for a little bit. Then, for those of you that have joined me before, you know that I'm all about the brain. So I'm going to talk about the role of the brain in this topic. Then I'm going to go one level down and see what is happening in the brain when we talk about emotional intelligence and well-being and social emotional well-being. I can't talk about this topic without talking about the impact of learning difficulties on mental health. Now, while mental health is like a sideline topic here, it has a huge impact, of course, on social and emotional well-being. Then I'm going to talk about the impact of Arrowsmith, what Arrowsmith is, and then Arrowsmith at TDCC. So here we go. Let's see. Let's look at these words that I've got on the screen here. These are words that come up when we talk about emotional intelligence, social and emotional intelligence, well-being, mental health. They come up when we talk about our children and how happy they are. And while I'm fairly certain everyone knows what each one of these terms mean, I'm not certain we all have the same understanding about what we mean by that. Because when I read articles or I read, pieces in magazines or on social media, sometimes I see these words interchange. So I kind of wanted to pull them apart a little bit today. I'm not giving a lecture on in-depth definitions of these, but I do want to pull them apart for our purposes today. So when we look at the word emotional intelligence, what this means is the ability to perceive, understand, and manage emotions. Not only our own emotions, but the emotions of others. And I think that's really important. We need a level of emotional intelligence to be able to connect and communicate with others. Now, Daniel Goleman, as you can see his framework here on the screen, and I'm not here to give a lecture on Daniel Goleman's work, but one of the things I like about his framework is what he has around the outside. And of course, it starts at the outside and it keeps going into intricate levels there. But around the outside of that framework, you will see some really important concepts. We see well-being, we see functioning, and we see performance. So performance like behavior, performance about, yes, I'll just leave it at that. So I wanted to concentrate on that outer layer because that's where I'm primarily going to talk about today. And you can do more work on Daniel Goleman's work and go into each of these other pieces. But you'll hear some of these other words come up from me today, the ones in the other levels. So that's emotional intelligence. So what is EQ, or emotional quotient? Well, that is emotional intelligence measured. It's like a measure. And that helps us, that kind of puts IQ and EQ, we hear those together, IQ being intellectual quotient and EQ being emotional quotient. So that hangs out there. But there is because it's a measure, it has been said that emotional quotient is a better predictor of success than one's intelligent quotient. And actually, the World Economic Forum added emotional intelligence as one of the top 10 skills needed in the 2020s. And as we've all entered into the 2020s and knowing what we've been through this decade, and we're halfway through now, I really understand why the World Economic Forum have done that. And I'm pretty certain everyone would agree. So emotions, this is probably not a hard concept to understand. These pictures say it all. We feel emotions every day. We go through our day feeling lots of different emotions. And people with high levels of emotional intelligence are able to effectively recognize and understand and manage their own emotions. So we have an understanding about what emotions are. Quite often, if you go back to Daniel Goleman's framework, emotions are something that we can see in other people. Sometimes we can't, sometimes they're held within. But it is like that performance piece, that behavior piece. And then, of course, we have well-being, which we could say is the state of being happy, healthy, comfortable. So I'm going to sit with this for a little bit. And for those of us that are parents in this group, and for those that are professionals that work with children or just other human beings, but I am going to focus on children here. Let's have a look. I want to ask this question. Now, I have parents here, but substitute your role if you are not a parent. What do we want for our children? This is what I hear, and certainly what I feel as a parent. Even though my children are all grown up, this is what I feel. And it's even when they're adults, it's sometimes really, really important that they're feeling like this. You want them to be self-aware. You want them to be able to manage their own emotions. We want them to have social skills. We want them to understand and recognize other people's emotions. We want them to have friends. We want them to be independent. We want them to have a growth mindset, that mindset that I can do. We want them to be confident and happy and have that good sense of well-being. We want them to be able to manage stress. Stress is a normal part of life. We have to be able to manage it. Of course, there are times in our lives where stress levels are higher. So we have to also then know how to manage that. When I read the questions that came through to TDCC by you for this presentation, I read a little bit between the lines, and I read that parents don't really want these things for their children. They don't really want them to have no friends. We don't really want them to have no birthday invitations or play dates or be asked for that. We don't want them to be a loner. We don't want them to have anxiety or depression. And we don't want them to be we don't want them to be socially disconnected, that should say. And we want them to we don't want them to rely on others to help them through life. We don't want them to have no self-worth. So the World Health Organization gives us this definition of mental health. Now, here you'll see another term here, mental health, which I talked about before. The World Health Organization says for good mental health, we need to be able to realize our full potential. We need to be able to cope effectively with the normal stresses of life. We need to work productively and fruitfully. We need to feel like we are making a contribution to our community. We need to feel fulfilled and have a good sense of well-being. And we need to be empathetic and compassionate. Now you'll see, even though this is a definition of what mental health, it fits into that social and emotional well-being, that emotional intelligence, all different terms, but really they all come together and interlock. And so this is the framework for what I'm going to talk about today. So let's have a look at the role of the brain. And in this moment, I would really like you to imagine this. Imagine that you go through life not really understanding what is happening around you. What is that person doing? What is that sound? Don't really understand that. Someone's asking me to do something. I don't really understand what they're asking me to do, but other people seem to be able to do it. I don't really understand why someone is shouting at me or why someone is crying in front of me. If you or someone you know goes through life like that, actually it impacts their perception of the world. They're experiencing the world very differently than you are. And this doesn't just happen when they're 5 or 10 or 15. This happens from when they're born. So those normal stages of development that physically and even intellectually, they're going through very, very well. We're very happy as parents, for example. We see our children growing and they're hitting those milestones. But if this misunderstanding or not understanding their world starts from their development, from the very, very first days, if they are not understanding that, then their development is shaped by that. And this is the role of the brain. The brain shapes us. How our brain is functioning absolutely shapes how we go through life and how we understand our life. You know, we always talk about in education, there's always incidents on a playground, for example. You'll understand this. And 2 children can come and say, this happened to me. And both children have a different explanation. And the teacher can see what happened. And what the teacher saw and how children experienced it can sometimes be 3 different things. And this is the role of the brain. Our brain shapes how we go through life. And that's why I'm putting the brain in this equation today to talk about this topic focused on the brain. So, as you've heard, if you've joined me in this webinar before, in this series before, you'll know that I've talked about this. The brain is behind every task we do. Not only every task, but every emotion we feel, every perception we have. And what we have in our brain happening is a whole lot of networks and highways that come together to experience, to complete tasks, to understand. These cognitive functions, these networks of regions that come together, these cognitive functions can operate, they function on this continuum. So these individual functions in our brain can be operating at superior level, they can be operating at an average level, they can be underperforming. So now I'm going to ask you, as adults, what happens when we enter a room that we're going to a gathering, we're entering a room. What's happening? Well, we have to go into the room, we scan the room, and we look for familiar faces. So, okay, who do I know here? Then we go in and say, do I remember those people's names? I'm not certain if I remember that. And if I do remember their name, what do they do? What's the context of that? Then you have some small chat with various people, whether you know them or you don't know them. You also sometimes enter into a discussion, sometimes a friendly debate. You also focus on the conversations and you avoid the distractions around you. Well, each of these things that you do when you enter a room, and sometimes you do these very, very quickly, each of these are calling on a different cognitive function of the brain. So I just say that because we don't really think about that when we enter a room and we just go in and start chatting and talking with people, and this happens so quickly in our brain. But this is exactly what's happening. So what I want to do now is go and look at emotional intelligence and social emotional well-being and go that level underneath. What is happening in our brain when we focus on emotional intelligence and well-being? So I'm going to give you another exercise now to think about what we ask children to do when they go into the playground. We ask them every day to go into school and acquire academic skills. We ask them to go into the playground, to the hallways, to the sports field. We ask them to navigate that. We ask them to follow instructions and rules. In fact, we probably remind them to do that as they leave the car each day. We also want them to make and maintain friendships. So underneath, just like when we enter into a room in a social setting, when they're entering into the school every day, they have cognitive functions that need to be working well, that require them to do these tasks. So for acquiring reading, writing, and mathematics skills, they need these cognitive functions. To make and keep friends, they need these cognitive functions. To follow rules and instructions, they need these cognitive functions working well. And to navigate playgrounds and hallways and sports fields, they need these cognitive functions to be operating well. Now, this is not an exercise in remembering all of those and knowing what they are. And if you did want to know that, because you've got the recording and you want to go over that, the definition is on our website. So you'll always be able to have learn about those different cognitive functions. But the main three cognitive functions that we are using when we talk about emotional intelligence and social emotional well-being, what are the three cognitive functions that really need to be performing well? We don't really want these ones to be underperforming because they're so critical in our lives. These are the three: symbol relations, predicative speech, and symbolic thinking. So this is what sits underneath this, these terms. These are the functions that are happening in our brain as we go through life and put ourselves in these social situations. Now, I'm sorry, this is a little text heavy, this slide, but bear with me. So you'll see down the left-hand side the cognitive functions. Beside that, you'll see the definition of those. So I'm going to start with the first one, symbol relations. This is the cognitive function that is responsible for understanding and connecting ideas. Now, earlier in that definition of emotional intelligence, I talked about understanding. This is the function that is responsible for understanding and processing complex concepts. There's probably nothing more challenging in our lives than understanding relationships, understanding the complex nature of what is happening in a relationship. Now, this doesn't just refer to relationships of humans. This also refers to relationships of concepts, right? But it's in this context, you know, it has a big part to play. So when we use symbol relations in this topic of social emotional well-being, this is where we're looking for logical reasoning and perspective taking. Remember, we need to be able to understand our perspective as well as others. This is the cognitive function that's important in this. I'm going to the next one now, predicative speech. Predicative speech is the cognitive function in our brain that it helps us with sequential logic, knowing that this is the order of things. This is how words interconnect. This is how procedures interconnect. So this is also responsible for internal dialogue. You know, when you practice going into that social setting, for example, we kind of practice what we're going to do when we go in. This is predicative speech. This is where we have that internal dialogue, and it helps us practice. Symbolic thinking is one of the executive functions, and this is the cognitive function of the brain that is responsible for planning and organizing, for problem solving, for goal setting. Remember, definition of mental health, being able to set goals for ourselves and achieving those goals. Very, very important. So, and this is also necessary for that self-regulation. So now I'm going to go down the right-hand side here and give you these scenarios, and then you'll see, I think, how each of these three cognitive functions are so important in these scenarios, where you receive constructive feedback from a presentation, on your presentation from a peer. So you have to understand what the feedback is. You have to know how to receive the feedback. And you have to know what to say. You have to plan and rehearse. What are you going to say now? And what are you then going to do in the future? You can see, I hope, that these three cognitive functions are involved in that scenario. What about the next one? You see a friend sitting by themselves and they're crying. You know, how do you proceed?
Pieces in magazines or on social media.
You have to plan.
Sometimes
First of all, you have to recognize that they're crying. That's the first thing. Then you have to kind of plan in your mind how you're going to approach that situation. Because there is an option that you don't approach. Are you going to step in, or are you going to leave that person by themselves? And that could very well be because of the scenario of what's happening around that person. So you have to be able to understand that scenario. And you have to then plan your actions because you don't want to hinder the person. So these three cognitive functions have to be operating really well to be to step into that scenario. And then there's another scenario where you have a deadline and you've actually realized that it's the deadline is earlier than what you thought. So how are you going to manage that? It's come forward. I had my deadline set for Friday, but now I have to have it ready Wednesday. So what are you going to do? Are you going to be thrown off course? Are you going to let your emotions do the talking? Are you going to be able to plan a logical sequence of procedures to get you through? Is anyone else impacted by how you're going to respond to the news that the deadline has changed? All of these three cognitive functions are so critical in these scenarios. I want to do one other thing here, and you'll hear me, and you would have heard me talk, if you've joined me before, you would have heard me talk about symbol relations just like I did then, and how critically important it is. So I have another couple of slides just on that, so bear with me. At Arrowsmith, we like to talk about, we look at things with a cognitive lens. Sometimes as a teacher, I know before I joined the Arrowsmith world, I would see behaviours and I would see them as I perceive them. With a cognitive lens now, I kind of go underneath those behaviours and think about what are the cognitive functions that are performing well in this scenario or underperforming. So here on the slide, there's a couple of scenarios that then help us understand how the symbol relations cognitive function is needed. So if someone lacks insight, whether that's into their own behavior, into the scenario that's happening, insight into someone else, into how someone else is behaving or reacting. This lack of insight may mean, so with a cognitive lens on that term, lacking insight, this may mean that they are having difficulty in making connections and understanding the relationships. So, and cause and effect. So this has happened, so this is why that person has reacted like that. They have challenges in developing insight into their own behavior. It prevents someone from understanding their own internal world and their external experiences. So that lack of insight could be because they have their symbol relations cognitive function is underperforming. In fact, they're not understanding. Sometimes someone's behavior looks rigid and stubborn. They can't change course. This happened yesterday and last week and the month before. This is how something always happens. And I'm not moving from that because this is how it always happens. Let's put a lens on that. They may be unable to see or consider alternative ways of viewing a situation. They may be unable to understand and process more than two ideas. So this is going to happen today, and then this is going to happen. We're going to change this routine today, but don't worry, we're going to do that activity another day. Someone that doesn't have that ability to understand that can be seen as stubborn or rigid. Also, if they have symbol relations that is underperforming, they're unable to understand the depth of someone else's point of view. So if you say, put yourself in that person's shoes, actually, they can't do that. So they can't say, oh yeah, now I understand, because I can put myself in that person's shoes. Actually, asking them to do that is something that their cognitive function is not able to do unless it's performing well, unless it's at average or above average functioning. This is where I'm going to take that side step over to the impact of learning difficulties on mental health. Too many times I've been in situations, in professional dialogue, in lectures, in big conferences, talking about well-being. No one talks about this topic. So, and I think it's critically important. No one talks about the impact of having a learning difficulty on mental health, on your well-being. So I have to do it because I just feel passionate that people really understand the impact of learning difficulties on our mental health. And this is research. There's a lot of research on this topic. So it's not something I've just made up. You'll see a whole lot of description here. People who are learning with learning difficulties are less likely to do well. There's lower levels of social acceptance. They are unemployed or less likely to be employed. So that self-worth is not there. They're less likely to be socially connected. So they are less likely to have long-term relationships. Their mental health is measured as usually poor or fair. There's depression and anxiety. Here are some graphs. The literacy level, people who are the percentage of unskilled readers in the population people with learning difficulties, they're unskilled readers, 72% of people with learning difficulties are unskilled readers. The general population, in the general population, it's only 37%. That's ages 16 to 21, that research. Employment rate. The general population of people who are, the employment rate is 89%. In the LD population, it's the unemployment rate, in the LD population, it's 51%. Employment, I'm saying that, I'm going to do that again. The employment rate in the general population is 89%. The employment rate of the LD population is 51%, so much lower. And then the mental health self-report. Now, this is people that have a diagnosed learning difficulty and they're self-reporting. So this is probably lower than the actual figure. In the general population, 8% say they have fair to poor mental health. In the LD population, it's 28%. And as I said, I think that's a higher figure than what is reported. In in relationship status and social emotional support, you'll see those stats there. 28% of adults with a learning difficulty are married or in a long-term relationship versus 54% of people without a learning difficulty. In social emotional support, the non-learning difficulty group reported more social and emotional support than the group with learning difficulties. And you'll see anxiety disorder in the non-learning difficulty age group of 15 to 44 is at 10%. In the learning difficulties age group between 15 and 21, it's at 20%, and between 30 and 44, it's at 30%. And this is the last slide, I promise, on these figures. Norman Doidge, you may be familiar with his work. He wrote a book called The Brain That Changes Itself, and he came across Arrowsmith actually and noted it in chapter 2 of that book. What he noticed, he's a psychiatrist, and he noticed that there were many people in his practice who he was doing therapy with, and they hit a block. They couldn't progress in their therapy because he realized they were not understanding. And he wrote the foreword in Barbara's book actually, and says that learning difficulties, detected or not, can have developmentally devastating effects on the human being, on broken dreams, on self-hate, depression, and substance abuse. The good news is that actually he came across Arrowsmith because one of his patients went to Arrowsmith and worked on symbol relations and increased the functioning of that cognitive function, then went back to Norman for therapy. And Norman didn't know what had happened because he was able to make a breakthrough with that patient. Why? Because that person now had a better understanding, could understand the world around him. So I always put that in there because when we do therapy, especially talk therapy, you have to be able to understand what is being said. Put yourself in someone's shoes. This happened because of that. This is all symbol relations, and that has to be working really well. So the good news is that we have the power ourselves to increase the functioning of the brain. We can increase our cognitive capacity. And when you put an increased cognitive capacity with really positive social emotional experiences, we can get positive well-being and emotional intelligence. So we have seen through the power of Arrowsmith that people understand themselves and their world with greater clarity. They process information more quickly and accurately. They make sense of events. They understand what's happened in the past and the present. They make connections and understand the reasons behind events in their lives. They experience this locus of control. I have control over my life because I understand. They see themselves as being agents in their own lives. There's reduced depression, anxiety, less frustration, more engagement, more optimism, more fearlessness. They're more able to engage in social situations. This is not just us saying this. This has been found by researchers who have looked into the impact of Arrowsmith on participants in the program. And these measures are on our website, so please feel free to have a look. But why don't we hear from a Arrowsmith alumni? Let's hear from Robert.
I'm finally free. I'm free from everything now. I'm free from all my problems and worries. I'm free from everything now. There are not enough words to describe how wonderful I feel after a year at Arrowsmith. I feel like a whole burden has lifted from my shoulders. I don't feel like I have to hold up the sky by myself anymore. I feel like I have passed it on to another person and that I'm free from the burden. I feel like I'm an independent person and that I can do things for myself now. Now I understand what freedom is for me. Now I understand that freedom isn't free time or doing the things you like doing best. Freedom is doing the hard work and putting in the time and effort into changing your life around so that you can be an independent person for yourself. So that you can have free time and do whatever you like doing best. That's what freedom is. All these years, I've always strived for and hoped for my definition of freedom and what it is and what it means for me. It's like a light bulb has just hit me. That's what everything in life seems like now. I just get things. It is beyond describing about how much that gives me joy and happiness in my life now. All I've dreamed for my whole life is just to be able to understand stuff for myself and comprehend everything that I come across. And now, I can do that. I can actually understand. It's like before the program, everything was black and white in my eyes. But now when I open my eyes, I see the world full of colour, and they are bright colours as well. Not dark, black and grey, but beautiful bright colours. It's like before, everything was ash, and now I can see fireworks high in the sky. And I hope that I can bring down those colours of brightness high up in the sky and bring them closer down to my level. And you know what? They're coming closer every day. And as soon as that comet hits the ground, I can't be stopped from reaching my full potential in life. I will help anyone I can with my advice and physical help and my mental help. And anyone who's holding up the sky to pass it on to the next person and to the next person and so on and so forth. I think it's fair to say I'm now ready for life. I am now free.
So quickly, I'm going to talk about what Arrowsmith is. It's a cutting-edge cognitive program. As you would have guessed, it's all about the brain. It's all about enhancing our brain to be able to learn more efficiently and effectively. It's not doing this in isolation, of course, because along with that, as you saw on my previous slide, the brain is functioning along with other academic programs, other social programs, other experiences. So, but what Arrowsmith does is gets the brain ready. It increases the power of the brain to learn and function in life. It's built on science, it's backed by science, it's evidence-based, it uses the principles of neuroplasticity, that is, the brain can change, and which is fabulous, fabulous news. And it's not just in one aspect, the brain can change in many, many different ways. And we have control over that, actually. We can help it change. In fact, no one else can change our brain. We have to change our own brains. And as I said there, it helps the brain learn more efficiently and effectively. The concept of neuroplasticity is that the brain can change its physical structure, and we need certain conditions to do that. And they're listed here. And these are built-in principles into the Arrowsmith program itself. So it's just absolutely built in there. And one of the good things about how Arrowsmith operates is a person is not on their own. They're always with a trained facilitator that helps with their attention, helps with their motivation, helps with their engagement. They're not helping the student or the participant do the work. No, because only the participant can change their brain. But they are there to be motivated and keep them on task and set goals. And what's one of the greatest joys, I think, in an Arrowsmith room is where you see children feeling confident that they can achieve their goals, that they can do this work independently. They have this self-worth because it's built into the program while we're strengthening the cognitive capacity of the individual. And Arrowsmith is a capacity-based program. We change the brain of each person so that we do not have to put in accommodations or strategies to be able to do a task. We actually change the brain to operate better. These are many cognitive functions that we have in our brain. There's more than this, and there's more than Arrowsmith can work with, but these are our main ones that we have. And you'll see this on our website. And I think the really important thing to know is that all our cognitive profiles are unique. So you, your spouse, your child, all of these cognitive functions operate on that continuum individually. Going back to the learning difficulties piece, Arrowsmith goes under those labels and we look at the cognitive functions that sit underneath those labels. If you want to know which cognitive functions are underperforming or even performing, you can do this cognitive questionnaire. Please feel free to do that. And of course, there's also a more in-depth Arrowsmith cognitive assessment. And I'm going to hand over to Emma now, who's going to be able to tell you more about Arrowsmith at TDCC. I said it's evidence-based, there's some research there, and then it's Arrowsmith is around the world, and of course in Dubai at TDCC and in Abu Dhabi. So Emma, over to you. Sorry, that was very long. I introduced you just a tad too early there. There we are, Emma.
No, thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you for your webinar. That was very insightful. So just to let anybody that's interested in Arrowsmith, we are lucky enough at TDCC to offer it. We have 3 different classes that are available. We have adults and children on board doing the Aerosmith, so anybody can join.